What does it take to walk out of hell?
Fernando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, it meant hiking for 10 days through the Andes, with no gear, no map, and no guarantee of rescue. Their 45-mile journey through some of Earth's most brutal terrain would push them beyond human limits. This is how two starving college students did what trained mountaineers thought impossible. The Old Christians Club rugby team boarded Flight 571 on October 12, 1972, expecting a routine trip to Chile. Most were students in their late teens and early 20s, joking about the match ahead. Nobody paid much attention when the plane hit some light turbulence over the Andes, until the pilot made a sharp turn too early. One passenger later described hearing a terrible metallic sound as the right wing clipped a mountain at 12,000 feet. The tail ripped away instantly, sending seats and passengers flying through the air. For 11 seconds, the remaining fuselage plunged downward like a falling elevator before smashing into a snowbank at nearly 200 miles per hour. When the tumbling stopped, 27 people were still alive inside what remained of the plane. The impact had killed 12 immediately, including both pilots. Survivors found themselves in a jumble of twisted metal, luggage, and bodies. The fuselage had split open like a tin can, exposing them to the freezing mountain air. Carlos Paez, 18 at the time, woke up pinned under 3 bodies with a dislocated shoulder. He could hear other survivors calling for their mothers in the darkness. Medical student Roberto Canessa crawled through the wreckage checking pulses. Some passengers had heartbeats, but weren't breathing due to altitude sickness. As the shock wore off, they took stock of their situation. They'd crashed in a remote valley at 11,500 feet elevation, far from any search routes. The temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 34 degrees Celsius at night. The only shelter was the broken fuselage, its floor covered in snow and blood. First aid consisted of alcohol-soaked gauze from the flight bar cart. They found some chocolate and snacks, but no proper first aid supplies or cold weather gear. One survivor used broken seat cushions to make makeshift shoes after losing his own in the crash. By nightfall, rescuers still hadn't arrived. They heard a radio report saying the search was called off due to bad weather. Passengers who'd seemed fine began dying from internal injuries as the thin mountain air worsened their conditions. When dawn came, the survivors could finally see their surroundings properly. Endless peaks stretching in every direction, with no signs of civilization. The Uruguayan Air Force had already searched the wrong mountain range. No one was coming unless they helped themselves first. The broken fuselage became their only refuge as the wind howled through the mountains. They cleared wreckage to create a cramped shelter about the size of a small bedroom, using luggage and snow to block gaps. The space reeked of blood and fuel as 27 people huddled together for warmth. 2 medical students moved through the injured, using alcohol from the flight cart to disinfect wounds. One survivor later recalled counting compound fractures by listening for screams during treatment. Those patients wouldn't last the week. Their food supply amounted to 8 chocolate bars, a few jars of jam, and some nuts scattered through the debris. They divided everything into tiny portions using an old playing card as a measuring scoop. Water came from snow, melted in wine bottles left in sunlight, a method they discovered when Fito Strauch noticed metal seat frames conducting heat. He later improvised sunglasses by cutting up cockpit visors after several survivors went snowblind from glare. Every morning at dawn, they positioned mirrors to flash signals at the mountaintops. On day 3, a collective gasp went up when they heard an aircraft engine. Parrado grabbed the shiniest piece of metal he could find, flailing it wildly as the plane crossed overhead. No reaction. The white fuselage blended perfectly with snow, invisible from the air. Watching the search plane disappear, medical student Gustavo Zerbino later wrote how some survivors began praying like they'd never prayed before. Nightfall brought unbearable cold. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 34 degrees Celsius, freezing urine before it hit the ground. They slept in rotating shifts to share body heat, waking every few hours to brush accumulating snow off their clothes. The stronger survivors took turns rubbing circulation into the injured limbs of others. Within days, arguments erupted over food rationing. One survivor hid extra chocolate bars under his seat, only to be caught by Fito Strauch during a supply check. Marcelo Perez, the rugby captain, mediated conflicts by reminding everyone they needed to function like lungs in a body. His leadership emerged alongside Roberto Canessa's medical knowledge and Strauch's engineering solutions. But morale cratered when they heard distant radio reports announcing the search had been called off. By the second week, the food ran out completely. Their bodies consumed their own muscle tissue, leaving some too weak to stand. They divided tasks. Some melted snow, while others tended wounds or repaired improvised tools. One group methodically picked insulation from wiring to use as thread for sewing makeshift clothes. The strongest among them now faced an impossible calculation. Waiting meant starvation, but leaving the wreckage meant almost certain death in the mountains. By the 10th day, the last chocolate bar was gone. The survivors sat in silence, staring at empty wrappers. Their bodies had already begun consuming themselves. Ribs showed through stretched skin, and some could no longer stand without help. That's when someone whispered what everyone was thinking. The only food left was the bodies preserved in the snow outside.
The debate lasted hours.
Some survivors vomited at the thought. Others argued it was no different than receiving an organ donation from the dead. Roberto Canessa, the medical student, pointed out that their friends would have wanted them to live. Nando Parrado recalled later, "We all knew the answer. We just needed permission to say it." They settled on a pact. If any of them died, their bodies would be used to keep the others alive. They started with small pieces of frozen muscle, cutting thin slices to make it last. At first, they could only eat at night, hiding the act from themselves. Some crossed themselves before chewing, others wept. But within days, the protein gave them enough strength to think clearly again. They dried meat strips in the sun like jerky, storing it in seat cushions for emergencies. Meanwhile, the radio parts scavenged from the cockpit proved useless. The batteries were dead, and no one knew how to rebuild a transmitter. That's when Parrado and Canessa made their decision. If rescue was coming, they'd have to find it themselves. The others helped prepare them, stitching together a sleeping bag from plain insulation and wiring. They gave the hikers extra rations, double portions of meat, the warmest clothes. The night before the hike, the group held a makeshift mass. Someone recited John 15:13, "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." As Parrado and Canessa packed their bags, the others quietly promised to wait as long as they could. No one said what they all knew. If the hikers failed, the rest would slowly starve. At dawn, the two men set out wearing 3 layers of socks and melted snow in wine bottles tied to their belts. They carried a crude map drawn from memory. Parrado's father had once mentioned a valley to the west. The remaining survivors watched them disappear into the white expanse, then turned back to the fuselage. Someone had already started melting snow for water. Another was checking the meat supply. The wait began. Back in the wreckage, they marked days by scratching lines into the metal walls. Avalanches buried the fuselage twice, killing more survivors each time. Those left grew skilled at spotting danger, listening for shifts in the wind, watching how snow piled against the plane. They rationed the last strips of meat, knowing it might need to last weeks. Every morning, someone still climbed to the highest snowbank to scan the horizon with a piece of mirror, just in case. After 10 days of brutal hiking through the Andes, Nando Parrado spotted a farmer on horseback across the Rio Azufre. He waved his arms wildly, yelling until the man noticed. The farmer couldn't understand their Spanish, but gave them bread and rode for help. Helicopters arrived the next morning. Rescuers found the remaining 14 survivors inside the fuselage, where they'd lived for 72 days. As Gustavo Nikolic had told them weeks earlier, "We're going to get out of here on our own." They'd survived avalanches, starvation, and freezing temps, but ultimately, their own determination saved them. The last survivor left the mountain on December 23, 1972. If you loved today's story, subscribe to Unsurvivable Survivors for more true stories that will leave you breathless. And if this moved you, share it.